Hello, my friends. Before we start this terrifying story, take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe. I always thought the desert was a place where time slowed and the world fell away. A place where a man could be alone with his thoughts. I was wrong. The desert isn't quiet. It isn't empty. It listens. It watches. And it waits for those foolish enough to wander into its heart. I learned that the hard way. The job seemed simple enough. I was hired to check a series of old mining claims in a remote stretch of Arizona. The company provided a truck, GPS coordinates, and basic supplies. I was to drive from point to point, take readings, and report back. Easy money for a week of solitude. I should have turned it down when the first warning came. It was a warm morning, and I was driving along a narrow dirt track. The horizon stretched endlessly. The sun shimmered in waves above the sand, making the desert look like it was breathing. I noticed something unusual. Tracks in the sand alongside the road. Long, thin, uneven, and impossibly straight. I stopped the truck. My curiosity piqued. They didn't look human. I followed them for a few feet, thinking perhaps someone had walked this way recently, but the tracks disappeared abruptly, as if swallowed by the earth. I shrugged it off. Nothing in the desert ever followed rules. By midday, I had reached the first claim. It was a small ruin, half buried in sand, wood rotting, metal rusted. I documented everything, took photos, and moved on to the next site. But as I drove, I began to notice something strange. The same ridges and dunes I thought I had passed hours ago seemed familiar, almost too familiar. I checked the GPS. Coordinates were correct. My truck's odometer was moving, but it felt like I had been driving in circles. I told myself it was just heat exhaustion. That night, I camped near a dry wash. The desert air was cooler, but heavy, thick. I set up my tent, cooked a small dinner, and tried to sleep. Around midnight, I felt it. A presence. I woke to shadows shifting around the tent, subtle but deliberate. The desert had no wind that night, no natural movement that could explain it. I lay still, heart racing, pretending to sleep. Footsteps approached, slow and uneven, circling my tent. I held my breath, and then silence. When I unzipped the flap, the sand was undisturbed. But the next morning, I saw footprints, not human, long, thin, trailing as if the walker had knelt and dragged part of itself along the sand. They led toward the distant hills and vanished. The following day, the desert began to warp. Roads I had taken were no longer in the same place. Mountains I had passed hours before appeared behind me or to my side. The sun shifted strangely in the sky, too low for the hour, and the horizon rippled like water. I saw something in the distance, a figure, tall, spindly, head tilting unnaturally. It didn't move, but it observed me. Whenever I tried to drive toward it, it disappeared, only to reappear elsewhere, always watching. I was terrified, but rationalized it as hallucination. I'd been in the sun too long. Dehydration was making me see things, but logic failed when the second night came. I camped near a small rock outcrop, and the sand around me seemed to shift. When I woke, there were patterns in the dunes, lines and shapes I didn't recognize, almost geometric, encircling my campsite. I felt their gaze, though I couldn't see them. On the third night, the presence became more aggressive. I woke to my tent shaking violently. Something heavy dragged across the roof, scraping long grooves in the nylon. I screamed and grabbed my rifle, unzipping the tent. Nothing. Only desert. But the tracks outside were unlike anything I had seen. Dozens of long, thin, perfectly straight marks, as if a creature with no joints had slithered or walked over the sand. By the fourth day, my sense of direction was gone. Trails I had memorized looped back on themselves. The desert stretched endlessly, dunes and ridges appearing and disappearing as I drove. Shadows moved unnaturally across the sand, stretching long and thin even in the middle of the day. I began to see figures pacing at the edges of my vision, tall, thin, heads tilting unnaturally, always observing. The fifth night was worse. I thought I saw a light in the distance, a small glow, flickering like a campfire. I approached cautiously, hoping for human contact. But when I got close, there was nothing. No fire, no camp, no footprints leading away. The sand was disturbed in concentric circles, patterns that seemed purposeful. My heart pounded. The desert wasn't just empty, it was alive, and I was being studied. By the sixth day, I was near breaking point. My water was low, supplies dwindling, and every movement felt watched. Figures emerged more clearly now. Long, thin silhouettes pacing along ridges, crawling over dunes, tilting their heads at angles no human neck could sustain. Some seemed to move in synchrony with me, mirroring my actions even when I tried to stay hidden. I realized the desert was learning me, my movements, my habits, my fear. I tried to escape. I drove recklessly, taking paths I hadn't mapped, hoping to find a road, a town, any sign of civilization. But the desert didn't yield. Roads twisted into loops, landmarks vanished or shifted. At one point, I swore I saw my truck parked atop a dune I had passed hours before. I ran to it, only to find sand and rocks, nothing else. By the seventh night, I was hallucinating fully. I saw people wandering the dunes, calling my name. I chased them, only for them to dissolve into heat haze. I saw reflections of myself moving independently in truck mirrors, in puddles of water that should have been dry. And always, the figures were there. Tall, thin, tilting their heads, observing, learning. On the eighth day, I realized the horror of what I faced. The desert didn't want to kill me. It wanted to understand me, to absorb me, to replace me. The figures moved in ways that mimicked my gestures, my stance, even my breathing. I was not being hunted for death. I was being studied for replication. I ran blindly across dunes, stumbling over sand and rock, fueled by a primal terror. The figures followed silently, never rushing, always pacing, always learning. The heat beat down, my water gone, my legs trembling. Time lost meaning. I had no sense of distance, only the persistent feeling of being observed. On the ninth day, I stumbled into a shallow canyon. It offered temporary shelter. I collapsed, shivering, exhausted, aware that the figures surrounded the canyon rim, pacing and tilting their heads. Some crawled along the sand like spiders. Others stood perfectly still, stretching impossibly tall. I watched them, knowing they weren't human, knowing they were learning every detail about me. I survived that night by hiding in a crevice, refusing to move. In the morning, I saw the faintest trace of a road in the distance. My heart leapt. I moved toward it slowly, carefully, knowing any sudden motion might trigger the attention of the creatures. Each dune passed revealed no figures, no movement. They had stayed at the canyon rim, patient, still observing. By the 10th day, I emerged onto the cracked asphalt of a forgotten service road. Civilization was not far. I collapsed there, half mad, dehydrated, and delirious. A passing truck noticed me, and I was taken to the nearest town. People stared as I muttered about tall figures, impossible tracks, shadows that moved independently of light, a desert that was alive. They laughed. They said I was hallucinating. Months later, I live in a small town far from the desert. I avoid the highways that run through it. I never travel alone, but I know the desert hasn't forgotten me. Sometimes, in the corner of a quiet street or the reflection of a dark window, I see them. Tall, thin, heads tilted, patient, watching, learning, waiting. I survived the desert, but I'm not the same. And I know that one day it will find me again. I thought I knew the desert. I'd grown up in Arizona, driven through the Mojave countless times, hiked the canyons near Tucson. I'd always believed the desert was harsh but predictable, a place where survival depended on common sense, preparation, and respect for the elements. I was wrong. The job seemed simple enough. A small private company hired me to check on remote solar monitoring stations in the Nevada desert. There were only a few points on a map, scattered across hundreds of square miles, connected by old service roads. I was to drive to each station, inspect the equipment, log the readings, and return. I thought it would be peaceful. The desert had other plans. The first day was normal. I drove the long dirt roads, stopping at each station, checking solar panels, batteries, and sensors. The desert stretched endlessly, the sun scorching. I passed dry washes, ridges, and scattered rocks. But even that first day, I noticed a faint sense of wrongness, something I couldn't explain. Shadows that seemed to move when there was no wind, tracks in the sand that were too long and too thin to be human or animal. I brushed it off. I was tired. By the second day, the oddities became impossible to ignore. I was following GPS coordinates to a station when the road seemed to curve unnaturally. I recognized landmarks I had passed just hours before, yet the GPS insisted I was somewhere new. I stopped the truck, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Just sand, sun, and rocks. Yet the feeling of being watched pressed against me. That night I camped near a rocky outcrop, setting up my small tent. The air was cooler than I expected, but heavy, almost suffocating. I tried to sleep. Around midnight, I woke to a scratching noise outside the tent. At first I thought it was an animal, but the scratching was deliberate, rhythmic, and moving. Something circled my campsite. My heart pounded, but when I unzipped the flap to check, there was nothing. Only the desert, calm and indifferent. Morning revealed long tracks circling my tent, thin, elongated, dragging in a way no human or known animal could make. They led up to the ridge and disappeared into the sand, as if the desert had swallowed them whole. I stared at them, unease growing, but I had no choice but to continue my work. The following days, the desert grew stranger. Roads I had memorized twisted back into themselves. Dunes shifted, hills appeared in places they hadn't been before. The sun moved in the sky as if it had its own agenda, and always, just at the edge of my vision, I saw figures. Tall, thin, unnaturally lanky, heads tilted at impossible angles. They never moved toward me, only observed. On the fourth day, I found something that made my blood run cold. One of the old monitoring stations had been tampered with. The solar panels were intact, but the equipment box was open, wires stripped, screens cracked. In the sand around the station were footprints, long, spindly, and dragging. They led into the distance and vanished. I realized then that I was not alone, and whatever had been watching me was closer than I thought. That night, I attempted to sleep on the sand. The heat had waned, but an unnatural chill crept into my bones. Shadows moved in ways that defied logic. I could hear the faintest scraping on rocks, the slightest shifting of sand. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, that the desert was playing tricks, but deep down, I knew otherwise. For the fifth day, my sense of reality began to fracture. Roads twisted, hills rose and fell in impossible ways, and the figures became bolder. I saw one standing atop a dune, perfectly still, its head tilted as if studying me. I drove toward it, but it vanished, leaving only a distorted shadow behind. The air felt heavy with awareness, as if the desert itself were judging me. The sixth day brought the most terrifying realization. The desert didn't just watch, it copied. I saw a figure mirroring my movements, walking along a distant ridge. I raised my hand, and it raised its arm in perfect synchrony. My breathing quickened. This wasn't a human. This wasn't any animal. It was something older, something patient, something that could learn. I began to understand what the desert wanted. Not my life, not my death. It wanted to study me, to understand me, to replicate me. Every gesture, every habit, every thought it could glean. I was a subject in its experiment, and the desert had been conducting it for centuries. By the seventh day, I was near breaking. My water was gone. My food supplies were minimal. I had no sense of distance or time. The figures moved closer, pacing along dunes, crawling like spiders, standing impossibly tall and still. One of them, mimicking me perfectly, even tried to speak in my voice. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the desert, unheard. The 8th day, I fled. I ran blind, stumbling over sand and rocks, desperate for any sign of civilization. The desert twisted around me. Hills rose and fell in ways I had never seen, and shadows reached farther than they should. The figures followed silently, learning, observing. Time became meaningless. I could not tell how far I had traveled or if I had moved at all. On the 9th day, I collapsed in a canyon, utterly spent. The figures lined the rim above me. I could see their faces now, elongated, hollow, tilting at impossible angles. They weren't human. They had never been human. But they had learned enough to mimic me, to anticipate me. The realization was suffocating. They didn't need to kill me. They only needed to wait until they knew me well enough to replace me. I survived that night by hiding in a narrow crevice, refusing to move. At first light, I saw a faint road in the distance. Salvation. I crawled toward it, each step agony, each movement observed. When I reached the cracked asphalt, the figures stayed behind, patient, waiting, their attention lingering like a shadow pressing into my mind. I eventually found my way to a small town on the desert's edge. People stared as I stumbled into the diner, dehydrated, delirious, speaking of impossible tracks, shifting dunes, figures that mimicked my every move. They thought I was insane. Perhaps I was, but I knew the truth. The desert does not forget. It watches, it learns, and it waits. Months later, I avoid the highways that cut through the desert. I never travel alone. I stay in towns under the safety of lights, surrounded by people. But sometimes, in the corner of my vision, in the reflection of a darkened window, I see them. Tall, thin, tilting their heads, patient, waiting, watching, and I know the desert remembers me, still learning, still preparing. I survived, but I'm not the same. And I fear the desert will come for me again, one day, when it has learned enough. I thought I knew deserts. Growing up in Arizona, I'd spent enough time hiking and camping in the Sonoran and Mojave to feel comfortable in the heat, the sand, the unending sky. I liked the silence, the isolation, the way it made you feel small but alive. But the desert I encountered on that trip was nothing I could have imagined. It wasn't just empty land. It wasn't just sun and rocks. It was alive, and it wanted something from me. The job was simple, or so I thought. A small environmental company needed someone to check old mining wells scattered across a remote part of Nevada. GPS coordinates, a 4-wheel drive truck, basic supplies, and a promise of generous pay. I had a week to complete the survey. I packed enough water, extra fuel, and a few days' worth of rations, confident I could handle the work alone. The first day was uneventful. I drove down dusty tracks, checked the wells, logged the data, and marveled at the quiet. The heat was intense, but manageable. I thought I might even enjoy the solitude. But by the time I reached the second site, the desert began to feel wrong. It started with the tracks. I noticed them in the sand as I approached the well. Long, thin, dragging marks, almost like a person had walked on stilts, but impossibly crooked. They led toward the ridge and then vanished, swallowed by the sand. At first, I assumed some prankster had wandered here, but I hadn't seen a single soul for miles. I shook it off and continued the survey. The sun dropped, and I set up camp near a cluster of rocks. That night, the wind died completely, leaving an eerie silence that pressed in on me. Around midnight, I woke. The air felt heavy, and I could swear I heard movement just beyond my tent, not the rustling of sand or the distant cry of an animal, but deliberate, slow steps. I froze. My hands shook. I wanted to call out, but my voice wouldn't come. I lay perfectly still until dawn. The desert, once indifferent, now felt sentient. When I unzipped my tent, the sand was marked with dozens of tracks, some circling my camp, some vanishing as though they had never touched the earth. I packed quickly, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next 2 days, the desert's strangeness escalated. Roads I had memorized twisted into impossible loops. Hills appeared where none had existed. The sun shifted unnaturally in the sky, low in the morning, high in the afternoon, then low again at night. And always I saw them, tall, thin figures standing at the edge of dunes, heads tilted at angles no human neck could sustain. They didn't move toward me, but I could feel their awareness, their calculation. By the 4th day, my water was low, and fatigue clouded my mind. I had driven what should have been 10 miles in hours, yet the landscape around me remained endless. I pulled over and set up a temporary camp, trying to rest. That night, the scratching began. Long, deliberate scraping across my tent. I froze, realizing nothing in the desert should make that sound. My flashlight revealed nothing, but outside, I could see faint movements, shadows shifting against the dunes, tilting, pacing. On the 5th day, desperation drove me forward. I had to find civilization. I drove along what I thought was the correct road, but the desert refused to cooperate. Roads curved back into themselves. Landmarks shifted. I spotted a truck parked on a ridge, my own truck, or a perfect copy of it. When I ran toward it, it vanished into thin air, leaving only sand. That night, I hid in a canyon. The figures were closer now. I could see them clearly, crawling along dunes, pacing like predators studying prey, standing impossibly tall, heads tilting unnaturally. One of them mimicked my gestures perfectly, lifting an arm, shifting weight, tilting its head just like me. The realization hit me. The desert didn't want to kill me. It wanted to learn me, to understand me, to replicate me. By the 6th day, I'd almost lost my mind. The desert's movements grew more deliberate. Shadows stretched longer than possible. Every step I took, I felt them adjust, anticipate, mirror me. I tried to sleep during the day, to travel at night, but the darkness offered no cover. Shapes moved silently across dunes, following, studying, waiting. On the 7th day, I stumbled upon an old shack half buried in sand. Curiosity overcame fear. Inside, I found a journal, old and weathered. It detailed someone else's journey through the desert decades before, someone who had vanished, leaving nothing behind. The entries described tracks that twisted and disappeared, figures with impossible proportions, and finally, a single line written in panic. It does not forget. It waits. It learns. I left the shack quickly, feeling eyes on me from every dune. The desert had been waiting for me long before I arrived. I realized I'd become part of it, a specimen to study, a life to observe. My own movements, my habits, my fears, they were now being cataloged by something beyond comprehension. By the 8th day, I'd reached the limits of my endurance. My water was gone, my legs felt like lead, my mind fraying. I ran blindly across sand and rock, desperate for any sign of civilization. The figures followed at a distance, never charging, never attacking. They mirrored me, copied me, watched me like scientists observing a lab experiment. The desert had no need for violence. It only needed to understand. On the 9th day, I collapsed near a ridge, convinced I would die in the sand. And then I saw a faint road, asphalt cracked and faded, leading to foothills. My heart leapt. I crawled toward it, my body screaming in pain. The figures stayed at the edge of the dunes, patient, tilting their heads, studying, calculating. Eventually, I stumbled into a small town outside the desert. I was dehydrated, delirious, muttering about tracks, shadows, figures that mirrored me. A desert that moved and learned. People stared, some laughed, some shook their heads. They didn't believe me. No one ever does. I survived, but the desert did not forget. Even months later, I see them in reflections at the edges of my vision, tilting their heads, patient, watching, learning. and I know that one day the desert will come for me again, to study, to understand, to replace. I am alive, but I'm not free. The desert is patient. It waits, and I know it remembers me. I had driven through deserts before, but I had never truly been alone in one until that summer. The job seemed harmless enough. Check a series of old communication towers scattered across a remote section of the Nevada desert, make sure the equipment was intact, record readings, and report back. The company warned me about the heat, the isolation, and the condition of the roads. They didn't warn me about what lived in the desert. I left Las Vegas early in the morning. The highway stretched endlessly behind me, and I knew the first dirt road I'd take would carry me far from anyone else. My truck was packed with supplies, extra water, fuel, food, a GPS device, and a handheld radio. I was confident. The desert is predictable, I told myself. It only punishes the careless. The first day went as expected. Sun blazing, air shimmering with heat waves, miles of empty road. I reached the first tower around noon. The panels were dusty but functional. I noted the readings and drove on. I passed small ridges, dry washes, and rock formations that seemed to stretch on forever. But as the sun fell and shadows lengthened, something felt off. I stopped near a rocky outcrop to set up camp. The air cooled, but the desert felt different at night. I'd spent countless nights camping in the desert before, and I'd always loved the quiet. This night was heavy. The silence pressed against my ears, against my chest. And then I heard it. A faint, deliberate scraping outside my tent. At first, I froze. Perhaps an animal, a coyote or fox, but the sound was methodical, moving around my camp in a circular pattern. My rifle rested nearby, and I gripped it, trying to calm my racing heart. I unzipped the flap slowly. Nothing. Only sand, only rocks, and the faint glow of the stars. When I checked the morning, there were footprints. Slender, elongated, impossibly crooked tracks circling my camp. They led to the ridge and vanished. I felt watched. I felt studied. The next day, I drove on. My GPS blinked erratically. Coordinates led me in impossible loops, back to hills I had just passed. The sun moved strangely, low and bright at times it shouldn't have been. Then, I saw them. Figures, tall and thin, standing on distant dunes, their heads tilted unnaturally. They did not move, yet I could feel them observing. When I tried to approach, they disappeared, only to reappear elsewhere. By the third day, I was exhausted. My water supply was dwindling, and I had no signal to call for help. The desert seemed to twist around me. Hills rose where none had existed. Dunes shifted like waves. I saw shadows moving independently of any light source. At one point, I swore I saw my truck parked on top of a dune I hadn't passed before. When I ran to it, it wasn't there. Only sand. I began to hallucinate, or so I told myself. I saw travelers walking the dunes calling my name. I ran toward them, only for them to dissolve into heat haze. I saw reflections of myself moving in puddles that shouldn't have existed, and the figures grew bolder. They mirrored my gestures, pacing in perfect rhythm with me, tilting their heads at angles I couldn't match. On the fourth night, I found a ruined shack half buried in sand. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. Inside was a journal, yellowed with age. The entries described someone else's journey through the desert, someone who had disappeared. It spoke of tracks that vanished, shadows that mimicked, a presence that studied and waited. The last page was scrawled in a panic. It does not forget. It learns. I left quickly, realizing that whatever watched me was not human. It was patient. It did not hunt, it observed. It had studied generations of travelers, waiting, learning, practicing. I had become a specimen. By the fifth day, I was near breaking. The sun burned relentlessly. My legs ached. I was dehydrated and paranoid, feeling eyes on me at every dune, every ridge. At a canyon, I hid, exhausted. I watched as the figures emerged at the rim. Some were impossibly tall, some crawled like insects, and one even moved in perfect mimicry of my own gestures. The desert had learned enough to imitate me. I ran blindly, stumbling across dunes and rocks. The desert bent around me, roads twisted into loops, landmarks shifted. Every step I took, the figures adjusted. Time lost meaning. The heat was unrelenting. I could not tell if I was moving forward or simply trapped in an infinite loop. On the sixth night, I collapsed near a dry wash. The figures were everywhere. I could see them pacing, tilting their heads, crawling. They did not chase. They did not attack. They studied, learning every detail of my body, my movements, my fears. I realized then that my survival did not matter. They only needed to know me completely. The seventh day was worse. I wandered endlessly, my mind fraying. The desert itself seemed alive. Dunes rose and fell like breathing waves. Rocks shifted when I wasn't looking. Shadows moved against logic. I had become part of the experiment. Every step, every glance, every breath was observed, cataloged, replicated. By the eighth day, I saw the first attempt at imitation. One of the figures walked along a dune, mimicking my exact gait. Another raised its hand just as I did. I understood the horror. The desert was not trying to kill me. It wanted to replace me. It wanted to learn enough to create something in my image, something that could step into my life if it needed to. On the ninth day, I stumbled across a faint road, cracked and faded. Salvation. I crawled toward it, my body nearly giving out. The figures stayed behind, patient, tilting their heads, watching. I reached a small town on the desert's edge. People stared as I collapsed into the diner, shaking, dehydrated, rambling about impossible tracks, shadows, figures mimicking me. Some thought I was insane. Some thought I had gone mad in the heat. I survived, but I am not the same. The desert has not forgotten me. Sometimes, in a mirror, I see shadows that do not belong to me. Sometimes, on long drives, I catch movement at the edge of the dunes, tall, thin, tilting its head, watching, learning, waiting. I know one day the desert will come for me again. It will not need to hunt. It will already know everything it needs to become me. And then I will understand what it truly means to disappear in the desert. I am alive, but I'm never safe. The desert never forgets. I didn't mean to get lost in the desert. I thought I knew it. I'd grown up around Arizona, driven through the Mojave more times than I could count, camped under the endless sky, and hiked the canyons near Tucson. The desert had always felt vast but safe, predictable in its dangers. I thought the hardest part was surviving the heat and the dryness. I was wrong. The job seemed simple. A small research company needed someone to check solar-powered weather monitoring stations scattered across a remote stretch of Nevada. They gave me coordinates, a truck, supplies, and a handheld GPS. I was alone, but I liked solitude. I told myself a week in the desert would be peaceful. The first day went as expected. Dirt tracks wound through ridges and dunes. The air shimmered with heat, and the sun burned bright above me. I stopped at each station, logged the readings, and moved on. But even then, the desert felt off. I noticed tracks in the sand that were too long and thin to be human or animal. They trailed to the horizon and vanished as if the desert had swallowed them. I shrugged it off. The desert plays tricks on the mind, I told myself. By the second day, the strangeness increased. The GPS began to glitch. Roads twisted into impossible loops. Ridges I thought I had passed hours ago appeared in the distance, in the wrong place. Sunlight shifted unnaturally, dipping low when it should have been high. And I saw them, the first time clearly. Tall, thin figures standing at the edges of dunes, heads tilted at impossible angles. They didn't move, but I could feel them watching. I tried to drive toward them, and they vanished, reappearing elsewhere. That night, I camped near a rocky outcrop. The desert was quieter than I'd ever known. No wind, no animals, only silence pressing down on me. Around midnight, I woke. Something was circling my tent. The sound was soft, deliberate, scraping across rocks and sand. I gripped my rifle, paralyzed with fear. I unzipped the tent slowly. Nothing. Just sand. Just rocks. But when I examined the area in daylight, the tracks were impossible. Slender, crooked, dragging like something with no joints had walked there. They led up the ridge and disappeared. By the third day, I was disoriented. The desert warped around me. Dunes shifted while I wasn't looking. Rocks seemed to move. Shadows elongated unnaturally. I saw figures more clearly now, pacing at the edges of my vision, tilting their heads. One figure mimicked my movements perfectly. I raised my arm, and it raised its arm. I ducked, and it ducked. I realized then the desert wasn't just watching, it was learning. I tried to ignore it, but the desert wouldn't let me. By the fourth day, I saw signs of other people, faint trails, footprints that twisted and vanished. And then, one of the towers I was supposed to inspect had been tampered with, equipment stripped, wires cut, and in the sand around it, dozens of strange footprints led off into the distance, disappearing entirely. The desert was not empty. It was active, alive. That night I hid in a small canyon. Figures lined the rim, crawling, pacing, tilting their heads, observing. One figure copied my exact posture. Every breath, every gesture, it mirrored. I understood the truth. It didn't want to kill me. It wanted to replace me, to learn everything it needed to be me. The realization sent a chill down my spine. I was a subject in the desert's patient experiment. By the fifth day, I had run out of water and food. My body was failing. The desert seemed endless, a trap of sand, sun, and shadows. Roads I remembered disappeared, only to reappear miles back where I had started. The figures grew bolder. Shadows moved against logic. I began to hear whispers, not carried on the wind, but inside my mind, repeating words I hadn't spoken. The desert was learning not just my movements, but my thoughts. On the sixth day, desperation drove me forward. I ran blindly across dunes, ignoring pain and thirst. The figures mirrored me, always at a distance, always studying. One crawled along the sand like an insect, its spindly limbs bending at impossible angles. Another stretched impossibly tall, tilting its head, watching. The desert was patient, infinite, and aware. By the seventh day, I collapsed near a dry wash. I was exhausted beyond comprehension, but I saw something. A faint trace of asphalt in the distance, a road, salvation. I crawled toward it, limbs trembling, heat blazing on my skin. The figures stayed behind, pacing along ridges, tilting their heads, waiting. I reached the town on the desert's edge, and people stared as I stumbled into a diner, speaking gibberish about shadows, tracks, and creatures learning me. No one believed me. Perhaps I had gone mad in the heat. But I know the truth. The desert does not forget. Even months later, I see them in reflections, at the edges of my vision, tall, thin, heads tilted, patient, watching, learning, waiting. I know the desert remembers me, and I fear the day it decides it has learned enough. I survived, but I am not safe, and I know one day the desert will come for me again. Thanks for watching. If you want the next terrifying story, hit like, comment, and subscribe.